So in this video, we're finally going to start adding the grid. Okay, so we're going to look at the CSS grid here. Spec document is part 2, and going into the checklist. Again, feel free to read all of this and looking at the spec document right here. Once you structure the grid, right, for all the main elements like the header, footer, main, aside, etc. All right, it's at a 4. And then the content styling and positioning of all the actual content inside of it is worth 6. So 10% total for the homepage conversion using the grid. Remember, this is a practice site, not a Port Hope sample site, but a practice site using the grid so that you can then convert your Port Hope site using this knowledge. So looking at the code inside of brackets, what I want you to do is go inside of your grid, and remember, you see this, right? So this was the index file, the main, and then the CSS grid here. So if you place something outside of a media query, then it's going to apply to all 3 different areas, as long as you don't place this inside of each one and override it. Of course, this is perfectly kosher as well. It could be a different value for site in each individual one, but if it's going to be the same value, as an option, you can always stick it outside and it will apply to all of them. So I want basically my class equals site that I've added to my body tag. I'm going to make it a grid, display grid, and this will become the grid container. It will become the parent, and these first level elements inside the body will become grid items, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These will all be grid items, and this will be the grid container right there. So again, we want to go display :grid. And when I preview this in Firefox, so remember, that's what you want. This obviously does Chrome, and maybe Chrome's good too, but again, Firefox is still the most advanced for the grid. So index.html, and if I want to make sure that's happening, I'm going to go into my practice folder, which you guys downloaded, hopefully as you're following along with me, and you want to go ahead and right-click the index file, go to open with, and then select Firefox. Okay, so here we are right there, and nothing is perfect at this point. But if I right click it and go inspect element, you should see that you have this body site over here. And what's good about it is you're able to see that here are the grid lines, right? So it's simply 1 column, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 rows. Right? And those 5 rows represent the header, the featured, the main, the aside, and the footer over here. So that's the start. This is the container. All of these are individual grid items. And now that we're actually going back, okay, we want to continue on. So I'm going to go into the grid here. I could do mobile first, but we were used to doing desktop. So I'm going to go into the desktop area. And in here, I want to communicate with my first element, and I'm going to copy and paste some code, and I'll have you type it. So here it is. Again, we had site up here, display grid. It's going to be display grid for all viewports, and I could have just done it in here, but let's go ahead in desktop and go .site, open close curly brace, and I want you to define a column and a row structure, and don't worry if you're confused still. All right, the light bulb will start to go off. Just allow yourself to kind of do this to start out with. So grid template columns, and then 3 values, and then grid template rows, and then 4 values. So do that, pause the video, and when you come back, it'll be done. So remember, you can always pause the video. I'm going to keep going. It might seem fast, but again, pause the video if I'm going to go too fast, which I will. Okay, so what's happening here is this is a property which defines how many columns do you want to structure your container. Right? So let's say you have this big container here. How many rows and columns do you want? Are you going to have 1 column and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows all the way down? All right. So here I specify 1 value, and this is going to be 1 column. This is another, and this is another. So remember, if you recall the in-class lesson, every time you have a value separated by a space, it creates another column. and each individual value can be any measurement at all. It could be a fraction, could be an EM, a percentage, a pixel, etc. Okay, and you can mix them and you know, change them up too. It doesn't have to be all consistent across. So here essentially you have 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. As soon as you add another value or take one away, you're increasing or decreasing that amount. So now that I've done that, and I'm going to go over here and refresh it, okay, you're going to see that it's all, you know, changed up now, right? So we have a grid of 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2 rows, and then believe me, there's 3, 4, and 5. But what it does is it automatically fills every single element, takes up a section of the grid. So this becomes the header, the featured, the main body, the aside, and the footer. Okay, but now basically that we have this grid, we have to map it out. So we want to say, well, you know what? I want the header to take up the full 3 columns of the first row, and this one full 3 columns of the next row. This one, the first, you know, 2 columns of the next third row, with the aside taking up the next one, and then the footer taking up all 3 on the bottom. So we have to position it using the grid. So what we do is, and again, if you're in class, you're in better shape. Obviously, if you missed it, this might be more confusing to you, but again, hang in there. So what we want to do is the following. We want to specify grid areas. And what this does is it gives each one of these guys a name, right? So this 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2, 3, 4 rows is an exact replica right over here. You have a container that has 1, 1, 1, 1 column, right? 2 column, 2 column, 2 column, 2 column, 3, 3, 3, 3. So 1, 2, 3 values are the 3 columns over here. The rows are 1, 2, 3, 4. And every time you have an open close quote, you have 1 row, 2 row, 3 row, 4 row. All right, so this is indicative of the 3 column, 4 row that you created. As soon as you have another value over here, if I don't want you to do that, but if you did, you'd have to add another value over here. Okay, and so forth, right? Because then you would have a 4 column, 4 row right over here. So that's just a sample. If you were to take one away, which I had to do anyway, but let's take that one away, then I would have to take the last value away over here, because again, this area is exactly representative of what's going on up here. So I'll add it back to what it was, 3 column, 4 rows, and I've given them the names. So now that I do that, I refresh it, and what's going to happen, as long as you have this checked off, remember, right click and go inspect element and display line numbers and areas, then you'll have the names and the numbers, and it will look like you're starting to work with the grid. Great. So the next step is to communicate with each one of your grid items. So if I go in here, remember, we're talking to the site. We're basically telling it to have 3 columns and 4 rows, and we're naming those columns and the rows, right? So now we know that as soon as you go display grid, these are the grid items. So we can talk to these grid items, and then when we name them, we can place them on this grid. That's a named grid now. So I'm going to talk to the header, the featured section, the main, the aside, and the footer, and I'm going to give them a name to fit them on the grid. So over in our one over here, I want you to do the following. I just want you to go header, open close quotes, and continue going down. I forget the name already. Is it featured section or something like that? All right, featured section. All right, dot featured section, because it's not a HTML5 element. And in there, we want to give them names. So I want you to go like this. Okay, so grid area, and it's going to be called header, and this one's going to be called featured. And remember, they don't have to be called the same thing. I could literally call this, so I could call this whatever I want. It doesn't have to be called header. Just because the selector is doesn't mean the name has to be. Obviously, it makes sense to do so, but I could call this whatever I wanted. So ABCD, this could be called, you know, I don't know if it starts with numbers or not, but I'll just go, you know, featured. And again, if this is ABCD, I can just go over here and go ABCD, and add that here, add that here. So whatever is called ABC, if there is something called that, which is this guy, then whatever content is here will be placed here, here, here along the first row, 1, 2, 3 columns. And if I save that and I go and preview it, you can see that's the case. So now this is taking up the full row. The fact that this this navigation isn't over here, irrelevant, because again, both of these elements are inside of header, and header now is taking up the full 3. If I want to move this here and move this over there, that's a nested grid I'm going to have to do later. Okay, but you can see now they're continuing to fill up their actual different areas. So now that this is taking up the first 3, then this is going to take up the next 3. Why? Because I called this featured, and then featured is located 1, 2, 3, 4, right? If I didn't have a name for this, then it's just going to kind of stack, same thing. This is all taking up all 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 for the next, but I can continue to map that out. So again, I'll call this featured. I told featured to be 1, 2, 3 over here, and it's going to be like that. Now, if I wanted to actually have featured be a little bit different than that, so if I wanted featured to go over here too, actually I don't think I could do that because it's there. So let's just, yeah, there we go. It'll take up the first 4. So, okay, so you see what happens. If this was taller, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then this is taken up now, so this can't fit there. And then it goes like that. All right, so literally we'll be taking up all of this and all of this if it had more content. So I'm going to continue on with the way it is. Basically, we have header and featured. We can copy both of these, Command C. Remember, pause anytime if you want, watch it again. This is going to be main, right? I might as well call it main. This is going to be side or aside. Why not sidebar? Remember, we're talking to the selectors, and the selectors are called header, featured section attribute, main element here, aside. There's no such thing as sidebar element. There's only called aside. I can give it a class name called sidebar, but not an HTML5 element, and then a footer. So those are the ones we're actually naming. So putting it on the grid. So main will be called main, aside will be called aside, or I can call it sidebar. Whatever, I don't know why, we might as well just call it aside if you're familiar with it, but just showing you it can be called sidebar too. It could be called right column, it could be called left column. And then you could go to footer and same thing, grid area, and we'd go footer. And as long as these guys all fit, so I'm going to change this back to header just because it makes more sense to do so. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is going to take it up like this. And then you just map it out. I want the header to take up the first column, all three columns first row, all 3 columns second row, because that's what I've stated. I want the first 2 columns of the third row to be main, the next one to be sidebar, which is the aside, and then the footer taking up the bottom 3 columns in the 4th row. And then when I go over here and refresh it, you can see that header all the way at the top, this, and then the footer, right? Looks good. It's all right there. Obviously, I'm cutting off just by screen rendition, but my footer is there, trust me. And if I right click it and take a look at the inspect element, you will be able to see that header, header, header all the way across, featured all the way across. All right, main, aside, and the footer. Looks good. So now talking about nested grids. You can place grids inside of grids, inside of grids, inside of grids as many times as you want. Just depends on what you need to do. Now, using the typical default HTML I taught you before, remember in CSS, you could float this left, float this right. Perfectly fine if you do that. But I do encourage you to have at least one nested grid as part of the spec document. So again, when I go inside of my index, I have my header up here. It is a grid item because the whole body tag attribute here is display grid. So these become grid items, and this is the container. But I can then make the header a grid container, and then anything inside of it next level will be the grid item. So now the logo box becomes a grid item, and the nav becomes a grid item. to the parent nested grid container simply by going to header and going display grid. So let's do that so we can section this on the left and the nav on the right, left, right, like it's supposed to. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to go over here and we're going to do the same thing we did for site. We're going to go display grid and we're going to do it in the header. So display grid like that. All right, so this now is a grid item of the site container, but it's also the grid container for the logo box and the nav, which become the grid items. So that looks really good there. Also, what we want to do is define the grid in the row structure, right? And we also want to name it. So we might as well copy all of this down to here and adjust it. So we're going to paste it and we're going to say, great, well, what do we need? We have 1, 2, 3, right? So, and now we want to change it. We only need 1 for the header over here, which is the logo, and then 2 for the nav that's inside the header. So we only need 2 columns for the header. So let's go and make 1 FR and 1 FR. I might customize that a bit. And how many rows do we need? Only 1, right? Only 1. One's going to be here, one's going to be here. It's all within the same row. So I just have to go 1 FR there. Maybe I'll tweak the actual value of this in a minute to customize it. And then I can go over here and simply go logo and then go nav. Take this out, take these guys out. All right, why? Because I have a 2 column, 1 row grid now. 1 column, 2 column, and they're all inside of 1 row, right? 1 logo column, 1 nav inside of 1 row. So that's a 2 column, 1 row template area right there. And then I got to go in and figure out what the names are, right? So I have a class here called logo box. I have another element called nav. So then I can go over here and do the same thing. I'll go enter logo box and I'll go grid area and I'll call it logo, call it whatever I want, but logo's good. And then I'm going to go nav, open, close, grid area, and I can call it main nav, doesn't matter. All right, again, nav would suffice too, but if you had multiple navigations, you could give it a different name. Don't forget to do the semicolon. All right, so, and I called it nav here, so they don't sync up, right? So I either have to go and do main nav over here, make sure it syncs up perfectly, or just do nav in both. Doesn't matter, whatever you're familiar with. So this will place the logo wherever I have logo, and this will place this nav wherever I have nav, and it should look pretty good. So if I go over here and I refresh it, all right, now you can see 1 is over here and 1 is over here. It happens not to be able to fit, all right, because this needs a little bit more room. So this one maybe doesn't need to be split perfectly half and half, right? So what can we do about that? We can adjust the values, and I'll do that right now. Okay, so I just simply changed the first column of the first row, which is the only row, to 470 because I measured the logo, and that's going to be plenty. And that will make this take up the rest of the room. So now that I've done 470 there, and I go back and I refresh it, all right, you can see that there's enough room for that navigation now. And if I were to turn off my grid here, just to kind of show it like the website is supposed to be, you can see that it's done, right? We have our logo, we have our navigation over here, we have this perfect, and we have the footer. Now remember, all of the styling was finished before, because that's all typical HTML you should be familiar with. What we did here is show you how to implement the grid to position your various elements on the grid, and even showing you how to do a nested grid. So this completes the desktop version, and the next video is going to be the actual tablet and mobile, and then we're pretty well done the home page. All right, so it's not too bad once you get past the initial intimidation of it, and of course you're gonna have to work it out for your own layout for Port Hope Fair. So we'll be back with the next video on the tablet. Thanks, guys.